Welcome back to dev.log. This week's video is a bit shorter because of last week's video taking up more time to edit than I wanted it to. Before I start, I would appreciate it if you would leave a like if you enjoy the video and subscribe if you want to see more videos. Now, before I start the actual development of the project, I wanted to set up the Docker containers for the client and server side. I also thought it would be useful for me to use them while I develop the project, so that is what I began to work on this past week. I started out working on the client-side container first. Doing this was the first time I have worked with Docker, so after reading the documentation and watching some videos, I was able to set up a simple Docker image. I then was able to build it and got it working as well. The next step I wanted to take was making the container be able for me to develop with. The concept was that when I make a change and save it on the host machine, it would then update the container and I would be viewing the container running on the browser. For me to do that, I needed to create a Docker Compose YAML to allow me to easily build and make a volume for the container. That took me a little bit to set up and required me to look up in the documentation and videos some more. Once I got the composer running and made sure that the volume was attached to it, I thought it was ready to work. I went to assess it by making a minor change to the default page. That is where I ran into the issue. I would change and save it, but it would not update. So I went back through and ran more tests to figure out what the heck was happening. I kept doing this until I got to the point where I made a change, saved it, and then went into the container itself and viewed that same file but on the container. Once there, I saw that the change was made, so it was updating the files on the container. The problem was that those new changes did not cause the project to be recompiled. It at least gave me a basis on what to research and investigate. Later, after doing some research, I found out that I needed to add some parts to the Next.js config file for it to work and recognize the changes and then recompile. After doing that, it finally worked. Honestly, I was so happy at this point that I got it working. My thought at the time for why this was all happening was related to the use of Next.js and how their commands work for running it in development mode, that it just wouldn't work right with a container. At that point, I thought it was time for me to move on and set up the server-side container. So I followed what I did before on making a Docker file and then setting up a Docker Compose file and went to see if everything was working. Once again, the container itself was up and running fine, but the changes made weren't updated. Now, I went to research how and where do I need to add the config that fixed the problem with the client-side container. I was able to find the code needed and I added it to the configs for the Nest.js server. I then went to test it again, but it was there that I noticed a big issue arise. It would update, but the time that it took for it to recompile would take forever. Now, I want to note, I did test both the client and server running on host to see if it was maybe just a project issue, but they worked perfectly fine. Having this issue would not work for the container to be a development environment. At this point, I was working on this issue for a long time and I just felt like I needed to take a step back from it. While taking a step back, I talked to my developer friend about it and he told me for what I was doing, Docker wasn't needed as a development environment. He agreed with having the Docker container, but that it would be good for when I deploy the site. It was there where I had to humble myself and remind myself that I don't need to go overboard. Overall, doing this was a huge experience gain, and I know a lot more about Docker now than I ever did before. I know down the line I will need to come back to the Docker files and then update them suited for deployment, but for now I'm going to leave them as they are and develop as I normally would have done before with other projects. On next week's video, you'll see me start the development of the client side and creating the homepage. Thank you all for watching, and leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to see more videos coming soon.